Hi, I'm Brooklyn. I'm with Block Party Quilt Co. Today I'm going to show you how to make one of my original designs. This is the Forest Dwellers Quilted Table Runner. Everyone loves this thing with the gnomes, the Christmas trees. It's got everything we need to make a great holiday table. I'm going to show you how to put it together, but if you haven't purchased it yet, you will need the pattern, and if you would like to buy the pre-cut quilt kit, we have the link in the bio for both of those posted below. This comes in a pre-cut kit. Now this is like the easiest way to sew things together. We have the backing, binding, all of the pieces for the top. They're already cut out with precision dies, so you know that they're perfect. You don't have to worry about that. And it has the pattern, which includes a template you can use if you want to make this project again. And it has all of the instructions that you'll need to sew it together with all the dimensions and different things. I'm going to walk you through the steps of sewing this together so that you can make sure you have a perfect table runner. This is a pre-cut kit, but you will need some other tools to make sure that we make it perfect. This is a ruler that you'll need for squaring up some of the blocks. We have a cutting mat, a rotary cutter. You'll also need pins for sewing this together. Some of these corners get a little tricky and we want to make sure we use pins so that it stays nice and neat. If you're like me, you probably need a seam ripper. This is a friction pen. It's a heat erasable pen, so once you mark on the fabric, you touch the iron to it and it goes away. There's one spot that you'll need to mark the thread or mark the fabric so that we make sure we get those lines correct. You'll also need thread that matches. So I'm going to be sewing mostly with this light gray thread. It matches the background color, but when you do the noses, which are the only applique in this project, there's 4 different colors included in the kit of these cute little circles. Make sure that you have a thread that matches each one, and that will give you the best finished look. So we're going to start by sewing together the triangles. For the triangles, we have the green trees and the red hats and the background triangles. So if we were going to sew these with these edges matching perfectly like this, it would offset with our seam allowance, and it wouldn't look right. So we're actually going to offset these triangles by 1/4 inch on top and bottom. Let's pin that in place. And then we're going to sew this. So if this isn't a perfect 1/4 inch, make sure that you're sewing with a 1/4 inch, and your 1/4 inch foot needs to be really precise. Make sure your needle's in the center. This project gets a little tricky if your seams aren't perfect. So I have a little leader on my machine. This is just something that I use to keep from having too many extra threads running around. It's just a scrap piece of fabric. I use it in between my seams. Makes things a little bit neater. So I'll sew to the end of that, pick up my foot, and place it exactly on that 1/4 inch right here. Pull my pin before I make a mistake and sew over the top. And then while I'm going, this is not a square shape, obviously, so it's not cut on the bias, which means that it might stretch a little bit as you're going. So watch for that and make sure that you're doing your best to keep it from stretching and keeping them nice and neat. I'm going to cut off my leader and sew it back onto the end. So I clipped a little bit of that off while I was doing that. That's okay. So when you open it up, you want to make sure that the seam where this ends is flush with the top of that. So I am happy with this because this all comes to a one point together. And then I'm going to press the seam towards the green. Next, we're gonna add on the red. So the green is the tree, this is the background. This is one of the gnome hats. So let's place it on the fabric. And we wanna make sure that that's about 1/4 inch and that down here is about 1/4 inch as well. You can measure in here and see how far away it is from that seam. So that is actually a little too big. We're gonna slide it up a little higher. And I'm measuring right here from the green, where I can see the green, to where the tip of the red is. And that's 1/4 inch now. So we're gonna pin it and sew it on. So now a check that you can do to make sure that this is right is that this bottom hat and the tree, they line up. We will have to make sure that this is a straight line. If your hat comes down too far or up too high, then it won't piece together right when you sew on the next element. Now this is all pressed. We're gonna do, always press towards the colored fabric. When you're doing a quilt that has almost like picture pieces like these gnomes, you want it to stand out from the background, and pressing towards the color is the easiest way to do that. So now it's all pressed. This is nice and neat. You want to continue sewing the whole row like I have here. And sew all the hats and all of the trees together, alternating which one's which. Then when you get to the end, we're gonna trim this off and make sure it's square. So to do that, we're gonna line up this bottom edge here, this tree edge, and make sure it's lined up at the top of the mat too. Then we're gonna take the ruler, and right here at the edge of the green hat, or the green tree, we're gonna slice off half of that triangle. When I was first making it, I thought that it would be easy to just cut a triangle like this and sew it on. It doesn't work as well as you think it will. So make sure you sew it on before you trim off that edge. So now we have our top row all done. Both edges are trimmed. We're ready to sew the bottom part. Let's start with what will end up as the beard on the gnome. We have 2 pieces. This is the same fabric as what we did the hat out of on the last one. And then this is a piece of background fabric. We are gonna sew these together to make a half square triangle. So let's put them right sides together. Put a little pin in if you want. Make sure that the fabric is lined up correctly. So here's our little pin. We're gonna mark the back of that straight across the middle in a diagonal line. Then we're gonna sew on either side of this diagonal line with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that that's sewn together, we're gonna take our ruler and cut right down that diagonal line so that now we have 2 pieces sewn together like this. I'm gonna press it with pressing the seams towards the red. All right, when you have a half square triangle, it's hard to get it to finish exactly the way you want. Sometimes they stretch, sometimes your angle's weird. You always want to square up a half square triangle. So we're gonna square this up. Now I'm squaring this one up to 2 inches. So I'm looking at this mark and this mark on the ruler, and I'm lining up the center line right here. And we're gonna cut off the excess off the top, flip it around, and do the same thing. So we have our little beard. these are gonna end up being our little feet for the gnomes. So to check which way that's gonna go, we're gonna flip it over here so that we're working from the back side. And we're gonna place this over the fabric, over the white fabric, with the reds closer together. That way when we sew it and we flip it down, we'll have the feet. So you can check to make sure that the feet are on the inside of the gray. So let's pin that in place. We want to match the corner of this right up to the corner of the white. Then to make sure we get a nice straight line, let's use our pen to mark the center diagonal line again. So we'll go across both pieces. And my pen's kind of in the way there, so I'll pull it out. And I'm gonna double check that that's lined up properly. Place my pin in, and I'm gonna sew a seam right on that diagonal line. And before I do any trimming, I'm gonna open it again and make sure that these red pieces are on the inside and the gray is on the outside. So I double check that. We're gonna slice off this outside edge a 1/4 inch away from the line we just sewed. So slice that off. Then I'm gonna press this seam open. So once this is nicely pressed, we want the seams pressed open. Let's take a look and make sure that these corners are square. So line up your ruler with the edge of the white on the top and the bottom. If you have any overhang, let's trim it off. Okay, and that one's pretty good. Just got some threads hanging out here. Okay, so now our first beard feet combo piece is done. We are gonna sew together the tree trunk. Now this is very, very simple. So take your tree trunk piece and your squares, and all we're gonna do is sew a 1/4 inch down to put the tree in the middle. All right, once I have that sewn, I'm gonna press the seams towards the tree trunk. Now that it's all put together and nicely pressed, we're gonna square it up. So it needs to be the same size as the beard piece. You can tell it's a little bit bigger. So all you're gonna do is line it up like this so that the tree trunk piece is in the middle, and we're gonna square it up to the proper size. And the pattern instructions tell you all about the sizing and where you're gonna need to square it, how big you need to square it, and it's all nice and laid out there for you. So here's our squared piece. We're gonna sew all of the beards and all of the tree trunk pieces together. Just again with the 1/4 inch seam. Then let's open that up, and we want to press it with the seams open. So now our piece is sewn together, our seam is pressed open on the back, and we're going to sew the whole row. And when your row is done, it's going to look something like this. The trees will be on the outside, the beards are going to be on the inside. Make sure that the pieces you use for the feet are the same piece that's on the top for the hat. So once we have our beard row and our triangle row sewn together, we are gonna match them up. And then this is the part where things might not fit perfectly together. And in my experience of 12 years as a machine quilter, I've learned something about quilts. that there's no such thing as a perfect quilt, and the same applies for this. Especially if you're new to sewing things that are not just squares, you might have a little bit of trouble lining this up, but I'm going to show you how to do it. So we take our pieces, make sure that our hat and our feet match each other, and then we're going to lay this seam where these two pieces come together right over the top of the intersection on the red and green. So you can flip it down, make sure it's right, and then we're going to place a pin. So I'll work my way down the row doing the same thing. You might notice that in some places you have to pull this, and in some places you have to pull the hat row, but that will all work out when we add on the borders. Worry first about where these seams intersect. So I'm folding this back to look at where the seam is and lining it up with the intersection on the red and green. So I mentioned before that we want these to be straight and line up. This isn't something that you can like sew and then trim it off. It needs to be straight when you sew it, or else these little corners won't match up in the right spot and it won't feel like your bottom row fits together. So I just wanted to point that out. In a lot of quilts you can do that, but in this one it doesn't work very well. All right, now when I sew this, I'm gonna sew with this back side, or the triangle back side up, so I can make sure that I am hitting my needle right over that intersection of the red and green and gray. Sometimes that might mean that your quarter-inch seam is not exactly a quarter-inch. You might have to wiggle it a little bit, but that is gonna make the whole thing look better if you're making sure you're sewing on the intersection instead of having a perfect quarter-inch seam. So I had to go up a little bit on that last part or more towards the fabric. So my seam was a little bit wider than a quarter-inch right at that intersection. After I do that, I'm just gonna ease it back down to a quarter-inch for the hat part. And then if it is bubbly like this, if you have a little bit of extra fabric, just try to work it in as you're going without making any tucks. Now that we have this all sewn together, we're gonna press, you can either press the seams open or you can press them down towards this end of the piece. Now that we have the top and bottom sewn together and we have the seams pressed downwards, double check that all of these little corners match up with the ends of these pieces here. And once you're satisfied with how that looks, let's go ahead and add on the applique noses. So I've picked this color for this side, and we are going to trim off just about a quarter-inch of one part of the circle. So make sure that when you do that, it's with the grain of the fabric so that you have a straight edge. And then we're going to overlay this on the seam that we made between the hat and the beard. So I cut this off so that I can make sure it's lined up straight. Make sure that the nose is in the center, and then we're gonna pin in place. So I've switched my thread color to the thread that matches this piece, and we're gonna sew right here along where the seam intersects. Just a straight line. We'll cut off the extra thread. and then flip that nose down. So if we are exactly in that seam, then it's gonna look like it is tucked in between the hat and the beard, which is exactly where the nose should be. So once that's flipped, make sure you're not stretching things too much, but we are gonna pin this in place. And then we're gonna use an applique stitch to go all the way around the whole nose. My favorite is a blanket stitch, but you can use a zigzag or any other stitch. Probably not a straight stitch because that kind of looks weird. And a tip with doing this applique is keep the outside edge of this right next to, so the outside edge of your stitch right next to the fabric, so that you don't have overhang, and that's how it will look its best. So just to get myself started, I'm going to start here at the top of the nose on the side next to where it's straight on one edge. And when I'm doing this, I make sure that I leave my needle down so that it's easier to turn and stay in place. And with the blanket stitch, it's really nice because you can make sure that that straight line of the blanket stitch is what's like tracing the shape. So you want to be careful not to rush through the step of the applique. It's a nice slow element. It's something that you want to take your time on. With the circle shape, it can be kind of hard to get it from fraying. So if you have ends that kind of start to fray like this, all you need to do is trim them. So once they're trimmed off, you're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and add on the rest of the noses and I'll meet you back here. So the next thing we're gonna do, we've added all these noses. We're gonna measure the top and the bottom. In theory, this will be the same size. In practice, fabric and sewers are not perfect. So this is where we correct for our mistakes. So I'm measuring here. I have 52 inches on the top, and the bottom of this, I'm just finding the center and measuring that way, is 50 and a half. That is totally normal that the top is going to be a little bigger than the bottom just because of the way that this stretches when it's not on the bias. So here's how we're going to correct for it. Let's take these strips that are included in the kit, and we're going to cut off the selvage and then sew them together end to end. And I've switched my fabric from the applique where I was using the brown and switched it back to gray. The number one issue that I have when I'm running into quilts, for other people, or sometimes for myself too, is that we forget to change the thread color. And then when the seams stretch, as they naturally do, you can see it through. So it's a real bummer when you have an awesome quilt that you can see the stitches through just because we forgot to change the thread. Now I'm going to press these seams to one side and I'm going to iron out the center fold that's part of the fabric. Now I have one big long strip of my background fabric that's my initial border. Maybe we shouldn't leave that wrinkled up in the corner. So I'm going to take the average of the lengths of the top and bottom of my quilt, or of my, my table runner. So 52, 50 and a half is 51 and a quarter. I'm going to cut this strip to 51 and a quarter, and that's what will even out the waviness between the top and the bottom. So when I was first learning how to quilt, I was taught by my aunt and my grandma. And they would tell me this kind of thing, like how to measure for borders and all of that. And I proudly went against their advice and did what I called shortcut quilting. And I've since learned that shortcut quilting doesn't give us the best results. So my advice is to not skip these steps, especially measuring the borders and squaring blocks. Those are the main things that can cause problems. So I found the center of this strip. I'm gonna mark it with a pin. And then I'm gonna find the center of this and mark it as well. And again, so in theory, the true center, or the center would be at the very tip of this green tree, but the true center is slightly to the side. So let's make sure we place a pin exactly where the center is and not where we think it should be. And then same on the bottom, let's find the center. So we have our centers. Now we're gonna open this up and I'm gonna start by pinning one strip to the top. So like I mentioned, it's since we took the average, one border strip is gonna be too long and one is gonna be too short. But we're gonna work the fabric to make sure that they actually match. So I pinned it on the very end, and now I'm gonna place a pin in the center, or line up the centers, and then place a pin. See, so even though that pin that's holding them both together isn't in the center, it's still set so that the thing is in the center. I'll come to the outside edge and place another pin. And then we're just gonna fill in pins so that this is, we can spread the extra fabric across it evenly. So now we have this like manageable section. Let's pull that so that we can find the center of this. And we'll just add a few more pins down the line. So since we've distributed the extra fabric evenly across the whole thing, you can't even tell that the sizes aren't the same. All right, now I'm just gonna sew that on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you wanna watch and make sure we don't lose the tips of the hats, sew from the back of the hat side so you can see where those seams are. So right now I'm just making sure that my edge of my border strip and the edge of my triangle strip are lining up right. Making sure I don't lose that. And then I'm flipping this over so that I can see where the triangle intersection seam is. All right, now our top border strip is sewn on. You can see we've done a good job at not losing those points from sewing in the back. We can make sure we watch that. Now, you don't have to worry about that on the bottom. So let's do the same thing where we pin this on. Now that we have her all pinned, we don't have to worry about losing points back here, so I'm just going to sew from the border being the top. Borders are all sewn on. I'm going to press this with the seams going towards the border. That way we're not going to force these ones back on themselves, and it'll be a better finish. All right, now that I have that all pressed nice and neat, we are going to do the same thing that we did on the top and bottom border, where we measure the side, both sides, and then take the average and cut a strip to that length. Now you're going to have a little bit of excess. We can just set that aside. We won't need it for this project. So add it to your scrap collection and use it to make something else that's beautiful. On the shorter end, it's a lot easier to line this up, especially because they're the same size. So we take it and we flip it so that it matches on the ends. And then we just place our pins. I'm just going to press the seam, same thing towards the border. Right now we're pressed all the way around. It's so happy, it's all done. Well, most of it's all done. You could stop here, but what makes this kit a home run is that it has this awesome square border around the edges. So the kit includes all of these red and green squares that are the same fabrics that are featured in the hats and trees. All you're going to do is sew them together in rows. So you place them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam, flip it open, and then sew them together in rows as directed in the pattern. I have all my red and green square strips sewn together. This is the outside border, so here's the 2 shorter pieces. Excuse me. Then here's the top and bottom. We want to make sure that the top and bottom pieces end in red blocks while the sides end in green. And first we are going to sew the top and bottom strips on. So similar to how we did this border, we're going to sew on this border. So let's find the center. Now that I have it all pinned, I'm going to sew with this side up and just a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so all the way down both sides. All right, now I've got these top and bottom sewn on. I'm gonna press it again towards this outside border, and then we will sew on the other side. So once I press these borders on this last strip that I sewed on, the top is complete. Now we will take it to the quilting machine and give it all of its finishing touches. So I'm back from the quilting machine. Let's take a look. Now I've also finished the binding. I'm obsessed with this candy cane fabric binding. I think it gives it such a fun touch. And if you look at the back, you can see we've done custom quilting with the swirls in between the hats and the trees. Everything's highlighted to make sure that the gnomes and trees stand out past everything else. And this is something that I did on my big quilting machine, but it's definitely a project that you can do on your domestic machine. So if you have any questions or comments, please make sure to leave those below and like and subscribe to see more videos from us in the future. Thanks.